There's a moment in every person's life when a single choice, made in a split second for no reason other than it felt right, quietly rewrites everything that comes after. Nathan Pierce didn't know, standing in a crowded bar on a Thursday night with rain soaking through his jacket, that stepping toward a stranger's discomfort would cost him nothing and change him everything. He didn't know the woman he helped escape a suffocating conversation would be sitting at the head of a conference table the next morning with his future in her hands. He didn't know his daughter would one day run across a schoolyard and make that woman understand exactly who he was. All he knew was that someone looked like they needed help, and he was the only one in the room paying close enough attention to notice. If you've ever been overlooked for something you deserved, if you've ever watched someone with the right last name and the wrong character walk through a door that should have been yours, stay with me. Drop a like and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain came in sideways that evening, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack, slanting hard off the glass faces of downtown buildings, pooling in the low spots of cracked sidewalks, turning the whole city into something that looked like it had given up trying to be presentable. Nathan Pierce walked through it with his collar up and his shoulders hunched, and his mind already somewhere else, running the numbers on a day that hadn't gone the way he'd planned, which was to say it had gone the way most of his days went lately. He was 32 years old, and he looked it. Not badly, just honestly. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there at 28. A particular set to his jaw that people sometimes mistook for stubbornness, but was actually closer to controlled exhaustion. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, the kind of build that came from years of physical work rather than a gym membership. And he moved through the crowded downtown sidewalk the way he moved through most things, quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention to himself. He hadn't planned to stop anywhere tonight. The plan had been simple. Pick up Emma from Mrs. Delgado's by 6:30, heat up whatever was left in the fridge, sit with her while she told him about her day because she always had things to say and she always wanted him to actually listen, not just nod while his mind drifted. Get her bathed, get her into bed, maybe look over the paperwork he'd been avoiding for 2 days, sleep, repeat. That was the plan. But the interview was tomorrow morning, and somewhere between the parking garage and the corner of 5th and Clement, the weight of it started pressing down on him in a way he hadn't let himself feel all day, and he stopped in front of a place called the Alderton, a bar he'd walked past 100 times and never entered, and stood there for a moment in the rain, looking through the amber-lit window at people who appeared to have nowhere specific to be, and decided that 30 minutes wouldn't ruin anything. He texted Mrs. Delgado first. "Running a little late, okay, if I'm there by 7?" She replied with a thumbs-up emoji almost immediately. Emma would be fine. Mrs. Delgado fed her better than Nathan did on weeknights anyway. The Alderton was the kind of place that looked casual from the outside and revealed itself as expensive the moment you stepped through the door. The kind of expensive that tried not to announce itself, which somehow made it worse. Low lighting, dark walnut everywhere, bartenders who moved with the studied calm of people paid to make you feel like you belonged regardless of whether you did. Nathan spotted the price list above the bar, noted that a beer cost $12, and decided he was having exactly one. He found a stool at the far end of the bar, away from the thicker cluster of people near the entrance, and sat down and ordered a pale ale from a bartender who didn't ask him how his day was, which he appreciated. For a few minutes, he just let himself exist in the noise without contributing to it. The low murmur of conversations he couldn't make out, jazz from speakers tucked somewhere he couldn't see, the particular clink of glasses and ice that belonged specifically to upscale bars and nowhere else. He drank his beer slowly and thought about tomorrow and tried to talk himself out of the low-grade dread that had been following him around all week like something he'd stepped in. The interview at Meridian Logistics was a real opportunity. He knew that. His supervisor at the warehouse distribution company where he currently worked, a decent guy named Hector who'd always been straight with him, had pulled him aside 3 weeks ago and told him that the new contract they'd been counting on had fallen through, and that if Nathan had options, now was the time to start looking. Nathan had 2 years of project coordination experience, a solid track record, and references who'd actually answer the phone. What he didn't have was a degree, which in most rooms meant you spent 10 minutes talking about your qualifications and then watched the interviewer's expression close like a door. Meridian was different, supposedly. They cared about performance, not pedigree. Or so the job listing had said, and Nathan had read it enough times to have it mostly memorized. He was halfway through his beer when he noticed her. She was seated at a table about 20 feet from the bar, tucked into one of the alcoves along the far wall. Mid to late 20s, maybe right around 30, it was hard to say precisely, with dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd started the day looking more put together than she currently felt. She wore a blazer over a dark blouse, and there was a glass of white wine in front of her that she hadn't touched in a while. Nathan could tell because the condensation had made a full ring on the table. Across from her sat a man who was maybe 60, heavy-set in the way of someone who had once been powerful and was now just large, with a watch that Nathan could see the gleam of from 20 feet away and the particular posture of a person who was accustomed to having his sentences finished by other people. He was talking. He'd been talking the whole time Nathan had been watching, which was only about 90 seconds, but it felt longer than that. The woman was nodding, smiling at intervals. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her in a way that looked deliberate, like she was physically preventing them from doing something else. Nathan looked away, took a sip of his beer, looked back. There was a difference between being uncomfortable and being in distress, and what he was seeing wasn't the first thing. The smile she wore was professional and intact and perfectly calibrated. She wasn't fidgeting. Her posture was straight. If you were across the room and not paying attention, you'd see a business meeting, maybe a mentor and a protege, or a client dinner that was running a little long. But Nathan had spent 3 years doing something that nobody gave you credit for and nobody trained you for, which was learning to read his daughter's face. Emma was 7, and she was fierce, and she could hold herself together through almost anything, through the confusion of starting a new school, through the other kids asking questions about her mom that she didn't know how to answer, through the days when everything went sideways and she needed everything to be fine. She'd learned early that sometimes you had to wear a face that didn't match what was happening inside. Nathan had gotten very good at seeing through it. What he saw in the woman at the alcove table wasn't panic. It was containment, the specific kind that requires ongoing effort. He looked away again, finished approximately half the remaining beer, had an internal argument with himself that lasted about 45 seconds and ended the way he'd already known it would end. He picked up his glass and walked over. He didn't have a plan, which was probably for the best because plans required information he didn't have. He just walked toward the table with the specific, relaxed confidence of someone who had a reason to be there. And when he got within a reasonable distance, he let his face shift into something warm and mildly surprised, and he said, "Hey, I thought that was you." The woman looked up. Up close, she was striking in a way that wasn't obvious from 20 feet away. Not because of any single feature, but because of the quality of her attention, the way she looked at him with an expression that managed to be simultaneously confused, wary, and, just at the edge, something that looked like it might be relief. "I'm so sorry," she said, and her voice was steady and professional and gave nothing away. Nathan," he said, extending his hand, looking at her with the easy warmth of someone rekindling a long-standing friendship. "Nathan Pierce. We met at it was at the Harding Conference. 2 years ago? You probably don't even remember. There were 300 people there." A single second passed. He watched her make the decision, watched it happen behind her eyes. The quick calculation, the assessment, the moment she chose to trust something she had no real reason to trust. "Of course," she said, and stood, and the smile she gave him now was different from the one she'd been wearing before. This one reached something. "I'm sorry, I was completely spacing. Long week. Charlotte Bennett." "You look great," he said, which was a thing people said in this situation, and which also happened to be true. He turned to the man across the table with an expression of pleasant, apologetic interruption. "I'm so sorry. I just spotted her from across the room and I had to say hello. I won't pull her away for long." The older man, whose name Nathan didn't know and didn't particularly want to know, looked at him with the particular expression of someone whose momentum has been disrupted and who isn't sure yet whether to be annoyed. He settled, after a moment, on something between gracious and impatient. Of course. Do you mind if I steal her for 5 minutes? Nathan said. Catch up? Go ahead. Charlotte set her napkin on the table with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to exit a situation gracefully, and she said, I'll just be a moment, Richard, in a tone that was warm and apologetic and implied she would indeed be back in 5 minutes, and then she walked with Nathan toward the bar. They didn't speak until they were far enough away. I don't know you, she said very quietly, not looking at him. No, Nathan said. You don't. A pause. How bad did it look from over there? He considered lying, decided she'd know. Pretty bad. She exhaled through her nose. I've been in that meeting for an hour and 40 minutes. He's been trying to get me to commit to a deal structure I can't agree to, and every time I try to redirect the conversation, She stopped. Sorry, you don't need to hear this. You don't have to go back. She looked at him then, direct and slightly incredulous. I have to go back. He's an investor. You don't have to go back tonight, Nathan said. You can say you have an early meeting and you need to review some materials. You can say your assistant texted you an emergency. You can say your car got towed. You pick. She studied him for a moment. Why did you do that? Nathan thought about it honestly. You looked like you were handling something you shouldn't have to handle alone. That landed somewhere. He could see it. She looked at him for another moment and then she said, Car got towed. That's a good one. And something in her face let go slightly, just around the edges. It's specific enough to be real, he said. She was quiet for a second. Then, I'm going to go back and get my things. Will you wait here so it looks like I actually know you? Sure. It took less than 4 minutes. Nathan watched from the bar as she returned to the table, exchanged a few words with the man named Richard, smiled the professional smile one more time, collected her bag, and walked back toward the door. The man watched her go with an expression Nathan didn't trust, but he made no move to follow her. Nathan left a 20 on the bar and followed her out. The rain was still falling, lighter now, more of a heavy mist than actual rainfall, and the street outside the Alderton was quiet compared to an hour ago. Most of the evening crowd had gone indoors. The sidewalk had that particular look of a city catching its breath. Charlotte Bennett stood just past the awning with her bag over her shoulder and her blazer doing nothing to keep out the November chill, and she turned when she heard the door open and she looked at Nathan Pierce with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read, which he suspected was true of her expressions in general. Thank you, she said. That was a pause. Unusual. Little bit, he agreed. Why did you actually do it? And don't say I looked like I needed help, because lots of people need help, and most people don't walk across a bar to intervene in a stranger's business meeting. Nathan leaned against the wall beside the door and thought about it. The mist caught the yellow light from the street and made everything look slightly unreal. He said, My daughter is 7. She makes this face sometimes. When something's wrong and she doesn't want me to know it's wrong, I've gotten pretty good at spotting it. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She sounds like a handful. She is, he said. She's also the best person I know. Those two things are related. Something shifted in Charlotte's expression. Not softening exactly, more like reorienting. How long have you been raising her alone? 3 years, Nathan said. He didn't elaborate and she didn't push, and he appreciated that. I should let you get home to her, Charlotte said. She's okay for another 20 minutes. I texted. An odd little silence fell between them, the kind that happens when two strangers have shared something unusual and neither of them quite knows how to file it. I'm Charlotte Bennett, she said, differently than she'd said it inside, like she was reintroducing herself outside the performance. Nathan Pierce. Well, Nathan Pierce, she shifted her bag on her shoulder. You are either a very good person or a very strange one. Probably some of both, he said. She almost smiled. It was the realest expression he'd seen from her all night. I have to go, she said. My car is actually around the corner for what it's worth. It didn't get towed. I know. Thank you, she said again, and this time it didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like something she meant. She walked around the corner and was gone, and Nathan stood in the November mist for a moment before pulling out his phone to let Mrs. Delgado know he was on his way. He didn't think about her again that evening. Not deliberately, but on the drive to pick up Emma, he noticed his mood was slightly different than it had been when he'd walked into that bar. Lighter. Not happy exactly. Just less heavy. Emma, for her part, took one look at him when he walked through Mrs. Delgado's door and said, "You look weird." "Thanks, bub," he said, and took her coat off the hook and held it out for her. "Were you nervous about tomorrow?" She said it very casually, the way she delivered all her most perceptive observations, like she was mentioning something obvious that she just happened to want to confirm. "A little," he said honestly. "You'll be fine," she told him, in the tone of absolute certainty that she'd inherited from nowhere he could identify. "You're really good at stuff." "Thank you, Emma." "I'm serious. You're better than you think." He got her into the car and buckled in and started driving home, and she talked for the entire 15-minute drive about a disagreement she'd had at school with a girl named Priya over whether a platypus was a mammal, which it was, and how Priya had eventually looked it up and admitted Emma was right, which was a very satisfying outcome. Nathan listened to all of it and asked the right questions and made the right sounds, and felt, underneath the ordinary noise of the evening, the particular tightness that came with caring about something and not knowing if it would work out. The interview at Meridian Logistics. The phone call. The chance. He'd been applying for 7 months. This was the furthest he'd gotten. Emma was asleep by 8:45. Nathan sat at the kitchen table afterward and looked over his resume for the 4th time, even though he knew there was nothing left to change about it. And then he put it face down on the table and went to bed and stared at the ceiling for a while before deciding that was not useful and made himself think about Emma's platypus argument instead, and eventually slept. Shut. The Meridian Logistics building was on the 15th floor of a glass tower on Caldwell Avenue, and Nathan arrived 12 minutes early because arriving 12 minutes early was what you did when the interview was the most important thing happening in your life. He wore the blue suit he'd bought for his wife's funeral and had worn twice since then, which was 2 times more than he'd wanted to wear it, but which was the best thing he owned, and he'd polished his shoes the night before, and he'd pressed the shirt himself, and he'd gotten a haircut on Monday in anticipation. He looked like a man who was trying, which was accurate. The lobby of Meridian was all clean lines and frosted glass, and the particular hum of a company that was growing faster than its systems could organize, which Nathan recognized because he'd seen it before, the organized surface over the productive chaos underneath. He gave his name to the woman at the reception desk, accepted a visitor badge, and sat in a chair by the window and looked out at the city 14 floors below, and told himself to breathe. He'd researched Meridian. He knew what they did: logistics technology, supply chain software, last-mile delivery systems. And he knew they were mid-size but expanding, and he knew the operations coordinator role he was applying for was a genuine management track position, not a lateral move. He'd read 3 interviews with the company's founder online. He'd looked up whatever he could find about their culture and their management philosophy, and he'd prepared answers to a dozen different versions of, "Why do you want to work here?" And he was as ready as a person could be who'd never done anything like this before. What he hadn't prepared for, what no amount of research could have prepared for, was sitting in a conference room chair, while one of the 4 people across the table settled a notepad in front of her and looked up and went absolutely, completely, perfectly still. She hadn't changed from the night before. Or she had. The hair was down now, loose around her shoulders, and she'd traded the blazer for a fitted suit jacket. But there was enough of the same quality to her presence that recognition was immediate, and apparently mutual, because Charlotte Bennett sat at the head of the conference table looking at Nathan Pierce with an expression that he would later describe to absolutely no one as the closest thing to pure surprise he'd ever seen on an adult's face. He didn't freeze. He almost did, but some functional part of his brain overrode the instinct and kept him moving, kept his hand extended, kept his expression level, kept his voice professional when he said his name, and shook hands with the 3 people to her left and right. She was last. Their handshake lasted exactly as long as a professional handshake should last. "Nathan Pierce," she said. "Charlotte Bennett," he said, like they were meeting for the first time, because in every way that mattered in this room, they were. She held his gaze for 1 second longer than necessary. Something passed through her expression, a decision being made, and then she set her pen on her notepad and she said, "Let's get started," and it was over. Polk out. The interview had 4 people on the panel. Charlotte at the head, a man named Vincent Hartley who introduced himself as the VP of Operations and who had the competitive energy of someone who wanted you to know he was evaluating you, a woman named Siobhan Park from HR who was taking notes and asking the structured competency questions, and a man in his 40s named Dale Corwin who appeared to be a senior director of some kind and who looked like he'd already made up his mind about something. Nathan had been in rooms like this before, rooms where the decision existed before the conversation began, rooms where the interview was a formality rather than a process, and he knew the feeling of it. Corwin had that energy. He answered Siobhan's questions directly and without inflating his credentials. When she asked about his experience managing projects, he talked about the 18-month supply chain reorganization he'd led at his current job, not talked about in the way of someone trying to sound impressive, but talked about the way he'd actually lived it, with the specific problems and the specific decisions and the things that had gone wrong that he'd had to fix. We had a 6-week window to restructure the receiving workflow across 3 shifts, he said. The original plan assumed cooperation from the warehouse supervisor on second shift, who had a different idea about how it should work. I spent 2 weeks having conversations with him that were uncomfortable before I understood what his actual concern was, which wasn't the workflow at all. It was that his team felt like they were always being handed the downstream problems that first shift created. Once I understood that, the solution was different than what we'd planned, and it worked better. Siobhan was writing. Hartley was watching him with the specific alertness of someone trying to catch the gap between the story and the reality. Corwin had his arms folded. Charlotte hadn't said much. She was listening in the way Nathan had noticed some people listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually receiving what he was saying. Hartley leaned forward. Your resume shows a gap between your last role and your current position, 3 months. What happened there? Nathan had prepared for this question. My wife passed away. I needed time to get things arranged for my daughter and get her settled into a different school situation before I went back to work. He said it without making it an apology and without performing grief. It was a fact. It was what had happened. Hartley nodded slowly. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Does the single-parent situation present scheduling challenges for a management track role? Hartley said, and the question was asked with the particular bland neutrality of someone who knew they were walking a line and had decided the information was worth the risk. Something tightened in Nathan's jaw. He kept his expression even. I've been managing my schedule as a single parent for 3 years while hitting every performance target in my current role and earning the highest peer review score in my department for 2 consecutive years. I don't see why it would become a problem now. A short silence. Charlotte said from the head of the table, What's your daughter's name? It was a left-field question, which was probably why she asked it. Emma, Nathan said. How old? 7. Charlotte wrote something on her notepad. Tell me about a time when you disagreed with a decision made above you and how you handled it. He recognized the question for what it was, not a pivot away from the scheduling topic, but a redirection of the room's attention. He was grateful for it without letting that show. He thought for a moment, chose the story about the routing software. About 8 months ago, our regional director decided to implement a new routing software across all 3 of our facilities simultaneously. I had strong concerns about doing it simultaneously rather than in stages. I thought the training burden and the parallel system issues would create problems that would set us back more than a phased rollout would. I put together a memo laying out the projected timeline impacts and presented it to my supervisor. He paused. The director heard the concerns and decided to proceed with the original plan anyway. What did you do? Charlotte asked. I made sure my documentation was thorough enough that when the problems came up, which they did, we had a baseline to diagnose from. And when the director eventually agreed to phase the remaining facilities, I made sure the transition documentation was ready to go so we didn't waste time getting started. Did you say I told you so? Hartley asked. The question had a slight edge. No, Nathan said. That wasn't going to help anybody. Corwin uncrossed and recrossed his arms. The interview ran 45 minutes, which Nathan knew was long for a first round, and at the end there was the usual language about next steps and timelines, and Nathan shook hands with all four of them and thanked them for their time and walked back to the elevator with his heart rate slightly elevated and nothing on his face to indicate it. He was almost at the elevator bank when he heard his name. He turned. Charlotte was standing in the hallway, her notebook closed and held at her side. "I wanted to—" She stopped, started differently. "You should know that what happened last night won't have any bearing on this process, in either direction." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You were very good in there." "Thank you." He meant it the same way she had the night before. She nodded once, which meant the conversation was over, and turned and walked back toward the conference room, and Nathan rode the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into the cold November morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before finding his car. He didn't tell Emma about the interview when he picked her up that afternoon. He told her it had gone well, which was true, and she said obviously, in the tone of someone who had never had reason to doubt this, and moved on to telling him about a book she was reading about deep-sea fish, which was her current obsession. "Did you know," she said, with the particular gravity she reserved for genuinely astonishing facts, "that the anglerfish makes its own light? Like, it doesn't need light from outside, it just makes it." "I did not know that," Nathan said, which was only partially a lie. "I think that's what you do," Emma said. "Bioluminescence?" "No," she said, exasperated. "You just figure things out. You don't need other people to give you everything. You make your own stuff." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window, already thinking about something else, the observation made and filed and complete. He turned back to the road. He thought about the conference room, about Charlotte Bennett at the head of the table, professional and precise and entirely deliberately fair. About Corwin's folded arms and Hartley's test questions and Siobhan's careful note-taking. He thought about the rooting software director who hadn't been wrong to make the call he'd made. He'd just been wrong about the specifics. And how Nathan had never once thought about making it harder for him. He thought about Emma's face, just now, looking out the car window at whatever she was looking at. You make your own stuff. He didn't know if he'd gotten the job. He wouldn't know for at least a week. He'd done everything he could do, and now it was somebody else's decision, and there was something almost restful about that. The specific relief of having tried completely and now waiting without the ability to change anything. He pulled into their street. The evening was gray and cold, but the apartment lights were on, visible from outside, and Emma was already unbuckling her seatbelt before he'd fully stopped, already narrating something about the anglerfish documentary she'd found on the streaming service that she absolutely needed to show him tonight. "After dinner," he said. "It's only 43 minutes, she said. "After dinner," he said again. She got out of the car with the particular brand of theatrical resignation that she'd been perfecting since about age 5, and he followed her up the walk, and she was already talking again before they reached the door. Some new fact about deep-sea pressure, something about how fish down there don't even know light exists as something that comes from outside themselves. And Nathan listened and answered and unlocked the door and stepped inside. And for a little while, the job and the interview and Charlotte Bennett and the whole uncertain weight of it all existed somewhere else, in some other part of his life, while he stood in his kitchen making pasta and listening to his daughter explain the ocean. The call came 9 days later on a Tuesday morning while Nathan was sitting in the break room at his current job eating a sandwich he'd made at 5:45 a.m. and looking at nothing in particular. He almost let it go to voicemail. He didn't recognize the number, and he had a rule about unknown numbers during work hours, but something made him look at it for 1 extra second and then slide his thumb across the screen. "Nathan Pierce?" said a voice he recognized. He set down his sandwich. "Yes." "This is Charlotte Bennett," she said, "from Meridian Logistics." His chest did something complicated. "I wanted to call you myself," she said. "We'd like to offer you the position." The break room was empty. The fluorescent light above the coffee machine had been flickering for 3 weeks, and no one had fixed it. Through the small window over the sink, he could see a parking lot and a gray sky and a strip of trees that had lost most of their leaves. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him slightly. "The formal offer will come through HR in the next day or two," she said. "But I wanted you to have the information now. Compensation, benefits package, and start date are all in the offer letter. I think you'll find it, I think it addresses what you're looking for." He was quiet for a second. "Mr. Pierce," Charlotte said, and something in her voice shifted, dropped slightly from the register of professional formality. The decision was unanimous. He didn't ask about Corwin. He didn't ask about the board. "I'll look for the offer letter," he said. "Good," she said. A pause. "Thank you," he said. "For calling directly." "Yes," she said, "just that." And then, after a moment, "We'll see you at orientation." The call ended. Nathan sat in the break room with his phone in his hand and his half-eaten sandwich in front of him for approximately 60 seconds. Then he picked up the sandwich, ate the rest of it, threw away the plastic bag, rinsed his hands at the sink, and walked back to his desk. He had 2 hours left on his shift. He worked them. That evening, after Emma was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and let himself feel it, really feel it, without the management he'd been doing all day. The relief was larger than he'd expected, and it arrived not as elation but as something more like the end of a held breath, a slow release of tension he hadn't fully admitted was there. 3 years of barely sufficient. 3 years of calculating. 3 years of looking at Emma and feeling the specific fear of a person who is not sure they are enough. He thought about calling someone and realized there was no one obvious to call. His sister lived in Portland and they talked occasionally. His friends from before, most of them had been their friends, his and Laura's, and those friendships had rearranged themselves quietly after she died. Not cruelly, just differently. He thought about Laura for a moment, which he did every day in ways both large and small, and it felt like it always felt, which was complicated, which was the right word for it. He was glad Emma was going to have more stability. He was glad because Emma deserved it, and also because he deserved it, and he was still, at 32, learning that both of those things could be true at the same time. He went to bed. He slept well for the first time in weeks. Orientation at Meridian Logistics was on a Monday, which meant Nathan spent the preceding Sunday evening ironing a shirt, packing Emma's lunch for the following morning with extra care, and sitting on the edge of his bed at 10:15 trying to convince himself that nervousness was just energy that hadn't found its direction yet. Emma, for her part, had declared Sunday a movie night and had selected something involving animated ocean creatures, which Nathan suspected was a continuation of her deep-sea research by other means. She'd fallen asleep on the couch before the third act, and he'd carried her to bed, and she'd half woken and said, "You're going to do good tomorrow," without opening her eyes, and he'd said, "I know, bub," and she'd gone back to sleep. He didn't know, but he appreciated her certainty. Meridian's office occupied the entire 15th floor and most of the 16th, and what Nathan noticed on his first day, what he filed away without quite deciding to, was how many people looked busy without performing it. At his last job, the busyness had been something people wore, a kind of protective coloration. Here it was something different. People moved with purpose and stopped to actually talk to each other in the hallways, conversations that looked like real problem-solving rather than the appearance of it. His direct supervisor was a man named Gerald Foss, who managed a team of 7 project coordinators and who met Nathan in the lobby at 8:50 and shook his hand and said, "Good, you're early. I hate it when people are late on their first day," which wasn't a warm greeting but was at least an honest one. Foss was somewhere in his mid-40s, compact and precise, the kind of person who kept his desk at a 90-degree angle to the wall because it bothered him if it wasn't. Nathan decided within the first 20 minutes that he could work with this man, which was a different thing from liking him. He met the rest of the team at a brief 9 o'clock check-in, a standing meeting, literally. Everyone gathered around a whiteboard in the open workspace while Foss ran through the week's priorities with the efficiency of someone who had done this 400 times and saw no reason to add flourish to it. The other coordinators ranged from a woman in her 30s named Pauline, who had the particular competence of someone who knew where everything was and expected you to ask rather than guess, to a 26-year-old named Marco, who had the competitive energy of someone in the middle of proving himself and wasn't subtle about it. They were cordial to Nathan in the way that new colleagues were always cordial, pleasantly, watchfully, reserving actual judgment for later. That was fine. He wasn't there to be liked on day one. What he noticed about the work itself by the end of the first week was that Meridian systems were good, but the handoffs between departments weren't. It was the kind of problem that didn't show up in any single report, but revealed itself in the accumulation of small friction points. A project coordinator who didn't know that the operations team had changed a vendor deadline, a communications gap between logistics planning and the client-facing account managers that was generating redundant work on both sides. Nathan recognized it because he'd seen it before, in a different context, with different people, and the shape of the problem was familiar even when the specifics weren't. He didn't say anything about it in the first week. He wasn't there to walk in and diagnose the organization. He listened more than he talked, took careful notes, and spent his first 2 Friday afternoons mapping out the workflow in enough detail to be sure he understood what he was seeing before he said anything to anyone. He saw Charlotte twice that week, briefly. Once in the elevator, where they were both with other people and exchanged a professional nod. Once through the glass wall of a conference room where she was clearly in the middle of something difficult. 3 people around a table, everyone leaning forward in the particular way of a conversation that has stakes. And Nathan walked past without stopping, and she didn't see him. He thought about her occasionally, the way you thought about things that were interesting and adjacent to your life. Not with intensity, just with occasional awareness. She was his CEO. He worked 2 full organizational levels below her. Whatever they were to each other existed in a category that didn't have a clean name yet, and Nathan had enough actual things to navigate without adding to the list. It was in his 3rd week that the situation with the Callaway account surfaced. Callaway Distribution was one of Meridian's largest clients, a regional freight company that had contracted Meridian for a full logistics software integration over 18 months. The project had been running for about 6 of those months, and Nathan had inherited the coordination file as part of his onboarding. What the file told him, when he finally had time to read it thoroughly, was that the project was behind in ways that the status reports weren't quite capturing. He brought it to Foss on a Wednesday morning with a printed summary. The delivery milestones in the contract are based on a resource allocation that changed in month 2, Nathan said. Somebody updated the internal timeline, but not the client-facing one. So Callaway is expecting deliverables that we're currently not on track to provide, and as far as I can tell, nobody's had that conversation with them yet. Foss looked at the summary. He looked at it for longer than Nathan expected. How far out? 6 weeks on the Phase 2 testing milestone, possibly 8 if the API integration issues aren't resolved. Who knows about this? On our side, the development team lead knows the timeline shifted. I don't think it went up the chain. Foss set the paper down. He looked at Nathan with an expression that was partially irritated and partially something else. Something closer to relieved, Nathan thought, though Foss wouldn't have described it that way. You've been here 3 weeks. I know. How did you catch this? I read the whole file, Nathan said. I didn't know what was normal, so I compared every document to every other document. Foss was quiet for a moment. This is going to require a client call, possibly a contract amendment conversation. Callaway is... He stopped. They're not going to be happy. No, Nathan agreed, but they're going to be less happy in 6 weeks when the milestone passes and nothing's delivered. Foss picked up the paper again. All right, he said. Give me today to talk to the development lead. We'll set up an internal meeting for tomorrow and figure out how we're telling the client. He paused at the door. Good catch, Pierce. Nathan went back to his desk, and Pauline, who sat 2 workstations over and had apparently processed at least the general shape of the conversation, looked at him over her monitor and said, Callaway? Yeah. I knew something was off on that one, couldn't find where. It was buried in the month 2 resource log. Pauline made a sound that was somewhere between impressed and annoyed. Marco's going to be irritated you found it before he did. Marco doesn't have to know I found it. She looked at him for a moment. You're going to be fine here, she said, and went back to her screen. It wasn't the kind of compliment that would mean anything to most people. It meant something to Nathan. The internal meeting happened the following afternoon, and then the client call the following Monday, and Nathan sat in on both, observer status in the first, taking notes in the second, and watched Foss handle the difficult conversation with a specific mixture of directness and accountability that Nathan respected in managers. No deflecting, no minimizing, clear explanation of what had happened and why. A concrete remediation plan. Callaway's operations director was unhappy, which was appropriate. and by the end of the call was cautiously willing to accept the amended timeline, which was the best available outcome. Afterward, in the hallway, Foss said, "Charlotte's going to ask me about this in our Friday one-on-one. She's going to want to know how it surfaced." Nathan understood what he was being told. "Tell her what happened." "I plan to," Foss said. "I'm telling you because you should know it's going upward." "Okay." "Most people would be nervous about that." "Most people," Nathan said, "weren't the ones who buried it." Foss almost smiled. It was brief and quickly contained. "Get back to work," he said. Nathan did. Xixian. Charlotte heard about the Callaway situation on a Friday afternoon, which was also the afternoon that Dale Corwin stopped by her office and spent 22 minutes questioning the hire. She'd been expecting this, or something like it, since the day she'd made the decision. Corwin hadn't argued in the moment. He'd abstained from the final vote, which was its own kind of statement, and which Charlotte had noted and filed without responding to. She'd known it wasn't over. He settled into the chair across from her desk with the ease of someone who had been in enough rooms like this to have no particular anxiety about them. He was 61 years old, had been on Meridian's board for 4 years, and had the particular conviction of a man who believed that his experience constituted a form of correctness. "The Hargrove candidate imestit," he said, which was his way of beginning the conversation they were about to have. "Douglas Hargrove," Charlotte said, "withdrew from consideration 3 days after the interviews." "I'm aware. What I'm saying is that the profile he represented, the experience, the network, his references were mixed," Charlotte said. "His last 2 project handoffs had significant client complaints. I can pull the documentation if you need it." Corwin tilted his head slightly. "You did due diligence on all the candidates." "That's what an interview process is." "Charlotte." He said her name with the particular patience of someone managing a longer conversation. "Pierce came in without a degree, without the industry network, He came in with 7 years of operations experience, 2 top performance reviews, and the clearest understanding of our actual workflow challenges of anyone I interviewed." She kept her voice level. "He identified a 6-week milestone gap on the Callaway account in his 3rd week, without being asked." A pause. "Gerald told you that?" "Gerald told me that. Yes." Corwin was quiet for a moment. She watched him adjust. He was a smart man, which was why he was on the board, and smart men made real-time calculations. "I'm not questioning his competence on the evidence so far," he said, which was a revision of what he'd been about to say. "I'm questioning the decision criteria." "The decision criteria," Charlotte said, "were the criteria we agreed on when we opened the position: leadership capacity, operational judgment, integrity under pressure." She looked at him directly. "He demonstrated all 3. In a single interview." "In a thorough interview process, yes. That's why we have a process." Corwin looked at her for a long moment. He picked up a pen from the edge of her desk. Not her pen, a pen someone had left there, and turned it in his fingers. "You're very confident in this one." "I'm confident in the decision," she said. "There's a difference." He set the pen down, stood. "I hope it holds." "It will," Charlotte said. After he left, she sat still for a moment, her hands flat on the desk in front of her. Then she opened her laptop and sent Gerald Foss an email. "Good work on Callaway. Can you include Pierce in the Phase 2 remediation planning?" She sent it, closed the laptop, and went back to the quarterly report she'd been working on before Corwin arrived. She did not allow herself to think about what she was doing in terms of anything other than what it was: sound management. An employee had performed well. She had acted on that information appropriately. That was the entire story. She mostly believed that. November turned into December in the way that November always did in this city, not gradually, but abruptly. A single cold front that arrived one Thursday and announced itself as permanent. The trees on Caldwell Avenue lost the last of their leaves over a weekend, and the holiday decorations appeared in the lobby of the building with the dutiful efficiency of an organization that had a timeline for these things. Nathan Pierce had been at Meridian for 6 weeks. He'd settled into a rhythm, which was different from comfort but was its own kind of stability. He knew where things were. He knew which problems were his and which belonged to other people. He knew that Pauline would give him a straight answer if he asked her a direct question, that Marco would try to scope creep any collaborative project until someone pushed back, that Foss communicated primarily through implication and expected you to understand what he meant without requiring him to say it twice. He also knew that Emma was having a problem at school that she hadn't told him about directly. He'd picked it up the way he always picked up the things she didn't tell him, through the accumulation of small signals. She'd been quieter than usual in the car. She'd eaten dinner without asking him anything about his day, which was unlike her. She'd mentioned a girl named Becca in a context that suggested tension and then changed the subject quickly when he'd asked a follow-up question. He didn't push. He knew Emma. Pushing made her go further inside herself. What worked was being available without making it obvious that he was available. It took until the following Tuesday. They were doing dishes after dinner. Nathan washing, Emma theoretically drying but mostly standing next to him with a dish towel and talking. When she said, with the casualness that he'd learned meant the opposite, "Becca said I was lying about not having a mom." Nathan kept washing the plate in his hands. "What did you say?" "I said I wasn't lying." A beat. "She said everybody has a mom, and if I didn't have one, it's because she didn't want me." The plate was clean. He kept his hands in the water. "That's a really cruel thing to say to someone." "I know." "What did you do?" "I walked away," Emma said. "Because you said when someone says something mean, it's usually about them, not about you. And you're right. I think she's just mad because her mom yelled at her at drop-off last week and everyone saw." He turned and looked at her. She was looking at the dish towel, not at him. "She's not right," he said. "You know that." "I know." "Your mom didn't leave because she didn't want you. Your mom died. Those are two completely different things." "I know, Dad." Her voice was steady in a way that was too steady. He dried his hands. "You want to talk about her? About Mom?" Emma was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I can't remember what she smelled like," she said. "That bothers me." Nathan felt something move in his chest, like vanilla, and something with cedar. It was her soap, I think, and coffee in the mornings. Emma thought about this. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Yeah, that's right." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him without making a production of it, the way she always did, stubbornly, on her own terms, in a way that still counted completely. "She really wanted you," he said. "She was so excited when you were born. She called you the best thing for 3 years, literally. That's what she called you." "That's embarrassing. You were too. You didn't have an opinion." Emma made a sound that might have been a small laugh. She straightened up after a moment and went back to the dishes, and they finished in silence, and later she asked him to help her with a project for school that involved constructing something out of cardboard. And the conversation was apparently over, which meant it was resolved, at least for now. He lay awake for an hour that night, not thinking about Charlotte Bennett or Corwin or the Callaway account or his career trajectory, but thinking about a cedar and vanilla smell and whether he still had the soap and whether Emma was okay in the particular deep way and what it cost a 7-year-old to hold herself together so thoroughly in front of people who hadn't earned the less composed version of her. She was so much like Laura. That was the hardest part and the most sustaining part, often at the same time. And the situation with Corwin came back in a different shape in Nathan's 7th week, and he didn't know about it directly. Not at first. What he knew was that a project he'd been assigned to lead, a mid-sized integration for a new client called Fenwick Freight, had its scope quietly reviewed by someone above Foss without Foss being notified first. Nathan found out because one of the documents in the project folder had been accessed and annotated by a user ID he didn't recognize. And when he asked the IT coordinator about it, the IT coordinator told him the user ID belonged to someone in board-level oversight. He sat with that information for a day before deciding what to do with it, which was take it to Foss. Foss heard him out. His expression didn't change during the telling, which Nathan had learned meant he was processing something he found significant. When Nathan finished, Foss said, "You're not wrong to flag it." "I'm not asking you to do anything about it," Nathan said. "I'm telling you because I think you should know." "I do know," Foss said, which told Nathan something he hadn't known before. "It's being handled." "Okay." "I mean it. Let it go and do the work." Nathan let it go and did the work. But 3 days later, Charlotte appeared at his workstation. Not at his door because his workstation didn't have a door, and she didn't send an email ahead of time. She just walked up to his desk at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon and said, "Do you have 10 minutes?" The two nearest workstations were suddenly very quiet. "Sure," Nathan said, and stood, and she led him to one of the small glass-walled meeting rooms off the main corridor and closed the door. She sat. He sat. She had her notebook but didn't open it. "Foss told me you found the access anomaly on the Fenwick project," she said. "Yes. And that you brought it to him immediately. That's what you do with something like that." Charlotte looked at him. There was something slightly different about the way she was doing it than the way she'd looked at him in interviews. Less assessment, more attention. "There are people at this organization," she said carefully, "who are watching your work closely. Not because you've done anything wrong, because of how you were hired." Nathan said nothing. Waited. "I want you to know that I'm aware of that," she said, "and that it doesn't change anything about your position here. But I also think you deserve to know the landscape." "I appreciate that," he said, and he did. Not because it reassured him exactly, but because it was straight. She was giving him information rather than managing him, which was a different thing. "Corwin," she said, and stopped. "You don't have to explain it to me." "I know I don't." She opened her notebook and then closed it again, which was the first uncertain gesture he'd ever seen from her. He's not a bad person. He has a different idea about what this company needs and who should be in certain roles, and he's entitled to that opinion. "But he's watching," Nathan said. "He's watching." A pause settled between them. Outside the glass wall, the office moved at its usual pace. People walking by, a phone ringing somewhere, the particular ambient noise of an organization that was permanently mid-task. "I've been doing this for 3 years," Nathan said, "carrying something and being watched for whether I'm going to drop it. I'm used to it." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "Is that what it is? Carrying something?" "Something like that." He thought about how to say it accurately. "You don't really get to put it down. You just get better at adjusting to the weight." Something in her expression shifted. Not softened, that wasn't the right word. More like recognized, like something he'd said had landed in a place she understood from her own experience. "Well," she said, "for what it's worth, and I'm saying this as your CEO, not as someone who owes you anything for a Thursday night favor. I made the right call hiring you. The Callaway issue alone justified the decision. Corwin knows that. He's adjusting." "Then we're fine," Nathan said. "We are," she said. She picked up her notebook and stood, and he stood, and she paused at the door. "How's Emma?" The question surprised him. He'd mentioned Emma once in the interview and once outside the bar. He hadn't talked about her since. "She's good," he said. "She's currently very invested in deep-sea fish." Charlotte looked at him for a beat, and something crossed her face that was brief and a little unguarded. Something that looked, from where Nathan was standing, a lot like genuine warmth. Then it was gone, and she was his CEO again, precise and professional. "Good," she said. "Keep doing what you're doing." She walked back out into the office, and Nathan stood in the empty meeting room for a moment before following her, and when he got back to his desk, Pauline didn't look up from her screen, but she said very quietly, "That was interesting." "Stop," Nathan said. "I'm just observing." "Observe less." Pauline smiled at her monitor. Nathan sat down and opened the Fenwick project file and went back to work. And if he thought about the conversation more than once over the rest of that afternoon, the specific way she'd said I made the right call, and the even more specific way she'd asked about Emma, he didn't allow that to interfere with anything practical. He'd learned over 3 years the difference between something worth pursuing and something worth noticing. He noticed it. That was all. That was enough, for now. The Fenwick freight integration went live on a Thursday in early January, 2 days ahead of the revised schedule, which was the kind of outcome that didn't announce itself loudly, but moved through an organization in quieter ways. In the tone of Gerald Foss's weekly report to Charlotte, in the fact that Fenwick's operations director sent an unsolicited email praising the coordination team, in the way Marco stopped trying to edge Nathan out of collaborative meetings and started instead asking him questions. Nathan noticed all of it and said nothing about any of it, because drawing attention to your own performance was a reliable way to make people like you less, and because the work itself was its own argument. What he was less prepared for was the board meeting in the second week of January, which he found out about not from Foss, but from Pauline, who had a talent for knowing things before they were officially known. "There's a full board review next Thursday," she said, on a Tuesday morning, with the specific delivery of someone conveying information they consider relevant. Corwin requested it. Agenda includes a performance audit of recent hires in the coordinator tier. Nathan was looking at his screen. He kept looking at it. "How do you know this?" "I know things," Pauline said, which was her standard answer and also entirely true. "Is it a standard audit?" "The timing is not standard," she said. "We don't do mid-year hire reviews in January. We do them in Q3. He absorbed this. "Okay. You're not concerned." "I'm concerned," he said. "I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to do about it." Pauline was quiet for a moment. "Keep the Fenwick documentation clean. Make sure your hours and project logs are up to date and correctly attributed. If someone's building a case, make sure there's nothing to build it with." "That's what I do anyway." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you to be especially good at it this week." He spent the next 3 days reviewing every document he'd touched since his first week. Not nervously, but carefully, with the specific attention of someone who understood that being right and being able to demonstrate you were right were two different things. He found 2 attribution errors in early project logs, both minor, both from the first weeks before he'd understood Meridian's internal naming conventions, and he corrected them and flagged the corrections to Foss in an email that explained what he'd found and what he'd fixed and why. Foss replied within an hour. "Good. I'll have the corrected versions in front of me for the review." The board meeting happened on a Thursday and Nathan wasn't in it, which was the appropriate thing. He wasn't a board-level issue. He was a mid-tier coordinator whose work was apparently being used as a proxy for a larger argument about hiring philosophy, and the clearest thing he could do was produce work that made the argument unnecessary. He found out how it went from Charlotte directly on the Friday afternoon when she appeared at the meeting room door again and said, "Do you have a few minutes?" in a tone that was professionally neutral in a way that told him nothing. He followed her into the room. She sat. He sat. "The review went fine," she said. "Your documentation was clean, your project outcomes are strong, and the Callaway remediation is officially considered closed. Callaway signed off on the amended timeline and the Phase 2 delivery." "Good." "Corwin is satisfied," she said, and paused. "That's not quite the right word. He's no longer unsatisfied." "That's something." She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one where she was about to say something she'd considered carefully before deciding to say it. "He asked whether you knew the review was happening." Nathan said, "What did you tell him?" "That I had no reason to believe you did." Another pause. "Did you?" "Pauline mentioned something," he said. "I made sure my documentation was in order, that's all." Charlotte studied him for a moment. "That's a very clean answer." "It's a true one." Something moved through her expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Corwin's issue was never really your competence," she said. "It was the decision-making process. He wanted to understand why I made the call I made." "Did he?" "He understands it now." She straightened the notepad in front of her, which didn't need straightening. "What I wanted to tell you is that you're not on probation in any meaningful sense. The review is done, the outcome is good, and I expect this to be the last time we have to have a conversation like this. I appreciate you telling me. I also wanted to say—" She stopped, chose different words. "The way you handled the access anomaly on Fenwick, you found something that could have been used to generate political noise, and instead of sitting on it or going around Gerald, you took it exactly where it belonged. I noticed that." Nathan thought about the routing software director he'd never once said "I told you so" to, about Hector, who'd warned him about the contract falling through before it was his job to warn him, about the specific way that trust, in his experience, was built not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small ones, each one invisible until enough of them existed to add up to something. "It's just the right thing to do," he said. "I know," Charlotte said. "That's why I'm saying I noticed it." They sat in a brief silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It had a different quality from the silences in their early interactions. Less guarded, less structured around the professional distance between them. Not personal, just less armored. "How long have you been running Meridian?" he asked, which was maybe more direct than he intended, but it was genuinely what he was curious about. She seemed to register the shift in register without being bothered by it. 4 years in March. I took over from the founder when he retired. He'd built something strong but not particularly organized, which is a common founder problem. How old were you? 26. Nathan considered that for a moment. That's young to take a company organized and make it more organized. 26 and completely terrified, she said, with a dryness that suggested she was comfortable enough with the memory to be honest about it. The first board meeting I ran, I'd prepared for 3 weeks and one of the board members fell asleep. Corwin? No. A beat. Different board member. He's gone now. She said it like the connection was entirely coincidental. Nathan almost smiled. What's the hardest part? Running the whole thing. She thought about it, which he appreciated. She didn't reach for the easy answer. The decisions where you have enough information to act, but not enough information to be certain, she said. Most decisions are like that. You get used to it, but you don't stop feeling it. What does it feel like? Like driving on a road where you can see about 50 feet ahead, she said. You keep going because stopping is worse, and most of the time the road continues past what you can see. But you're always aware that you don't actually know. He sat with that for a moment. It was honest in a way he hadn't expected, and it recalibrated something about the way he understood her. Not the CEO who'd made the room go quiet in his interview, not the woman he'd helped escape a suffocating dinner, but something more specific and more complicated than either of those. I should let you get back, she said, and the professional register returned. Not abruptly, just as a natural transition, the way a door closes without slamming. Thank you, Nathan said, for the update. Of course. She stood, picked up her notebook. Then, at the door, Emma still doing the deep-sea fish? She's moved into bioluminescence specifically. I've learned more about anglerfish in the last 2 months than I ever anticipated. Charlotte laughed, a real one, brief and genuine. Nothing performed about it. It changed her face in a way that Nathan noticed and immediately did not pursue as a thought. My niece was obsessed with volcanoes for a year, she said. Every conversation eventually became about volcanoes. Does it end? She moved on to weather systems. A pause. So, no. She walked out, and Nathan sat in the empty room for approximately 30 seconds before going back to his desk, and Pauline did not say a single thing, which was more communicative somehow than if she had. Thus, February arrived with the particular mood of a month that knew nobody wanted it there, gray and close and cold without being interesting about it. Nathan's commute involved a bus transfer that was unreliable in good weather and worse in February. So he'd started leaving 12 minutes earlier and arriving at the office slightly before most of the team, which he hadn't planned but which turned out to suit him. The early hours, before the office reached full noise, were when he thought most clearly. It was on one of those early mornings that he found the problem with the Ralston account. Ralston was a newer client, freight and warehouse management for a mid-sized retail distributor, and their integration project was still in the planning phase, which meant Nathan was working primarily on the implementation timeline and vendor coordination. He was cross-referencing contract terms against the proposed delivery schedule when something stopped him. He went back and read the specific clause twice, then a third time. The contract had a penalty clause for project delays, 10% of the contract value per week beyond the initially agreed delivery date. Standard enough. What was not standard was that the delivery date in the contract didn't match the delivery date in the project plan. Someone had transcribed it differently, a 2-week error that moved the contractual deadline earlier than the project team was planning for. If the integration ran on the project timeline, Meridian would be in technical breach of the contract before the delivery phase even began. Nathan sat with his coffee for a long moment. The office around him was still mostly quiet. 2 other early arrivals, neither on his team. Through the windows, the city was just becoming visible under a pale February sky. The error was administrative. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't a cover-up. It was a transcription mistake that had been in the documents for 3 months without anyone catching it. The question was what to do with it, and the answer was the same answer it always was. Take it to the right person, do it fast, and document everything. He took it to Foss at 8:15 when Foss arrived. Foss read the relevant sections. He set the documents down. You're sure? The contract date and the project plan date are different by 14 days. The contract is what's legally binding. I know that, Foss said without irritation. He stopped. All right, this goes to legal and to Charlotte today. I thought it should. Do you have this documented? The discrepancy, the source documents, the timeline for when each was created? I pulled it together this morning, Nathan said. I can have a clean summary to you in 30 minutes. Foss looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. You know this is going to be a significant conversation. With legal, with Ralston, potentially. I know. And you came to me with it at 8:15 on a Tuesday. 8:17, Nathan said. I read it 3 times first. Something in Foss's expression changed. Not dramatically. He just looked, briefly, like a man who was reassessing a calculation. Get me the summary, he said. The meeting with Charlotte and Meridian's general counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Vane, happened that afternoon in Charlotte's office. Nathan, Foss, and Vane, with Charlotte at her desk and the documents spread in front of all of them. Vane read everything carefully and said, This needs to be corrected and Ralston needs to be informed. We can't proceed on a contract with an internal date discrepancy. Agreed, Charlotte said. She looked at Nathan. When did you find this? This morning, 7:52. Charlotte's expression was even and professional. And the summary you sent Gerald, you put this together before 8:15? Before 8:30, Nathan said. I wanted to be sure I understood what I was looking at before I brought it up. Vane made a note. We'll need to reach out to Ralston's legal contact and frame this correctly. A clean correction with full transparency. The exposure here is manageable if we handle it proactively. She looked at Charlotte. If this had surfaced at the Phase 2 handoff, we'd be looking at a much more complicated conversation. Charlotte said, I know, and looked at Nathan one more time, briefly, and then back at the documents. The Ralston correction took 2 weeks to fully resolve. A contract amendment, a revised project timeline, and a transparent call with Ralston's leadership that Vane and Charlotte handled with the kind of careful honesty that preserved the relationship even while acknowledging the error. Ralston was frustrated. They were also ultimately appreciative of the fact that it had been caught and communicated immediately before it caused actual harm. Nathan was not in any of those conversations. His job had been to find the problem and hand it to the people whose job it was to fix it. He did that. He went back to his desk and kept working. Corwin, Nathan was told by no one directly, but understood through the ambient information transfer that happened in any organization, said nothing about it at all. His silence on the matter was, in its way, its own kind of acknowledgement. March brought the first real thaw, and with it something that Nathan hadn't quite planned for, a growing awareness that the line between professional and personal, where Charlotte Bennett was concerned, was becoming harder to locate. It hadn't happened all at once. It accumulated the way most things accumulated, through small moments, each individually explainable, that collectively added up to something he couldn't entirely explain away. There was the Tuesday afternoon she'd stopped by his workstation, not for a meeting room conversation, just stopped by, with coffee in her hand, and asked him whether he thought the Phase 2 rollout for the new warehouse management module should be staggered by region or deployed simultaneously. He told her staggered, with specific reasoning, and she'd listened and said, "That's what I think too," and walked away. It was a 30-second conversation about operational strategy. He thought about it for longer than 30 seconds. There was the Thursday morning he'd arrived early and found her already in the kitchen area, standing over the coffee machine with the particular expression of someone who is barely functional before caffeine, wearing a blazer that she hadn't fully settled into yet, hair not quite as composed as it was by 9 o'clock, and she'd looked up and said, "Don't." And he'd said, "What?" And she'd said, "Whatever you're about to say about how early I'm in." And he'd said, "I wasn't going to say anything." And she'd said, "Good." And they'd stood in companionable silence while the coffee finished, and he'd poured her a cup before pouring his own, without really deciding to, and she'd taken it without making a thing of it, and they'd gone back to their respective parts of the floor. He thought about that one too. probably more than he should have. There was also the fact that she'd remembered Emma's bioluminescence phase and had asked about it 3 weeks later in passing. Is it still anglerfish? And he'd said she'd moved on to the mimic octopus, and Charlotte had said, of course she has, with a warmth that caught him off guard. Nathan was not a person who lied to himself about things. It was one of the few qualities he was certain he possessed, a persistent, sometimes inconvenient honesty about what was actually happening. And what was actually happening, he was increasingly aware, was that he liked Charlotte Bennett. Not in the careful way you liked a competent colleague. In a different way that had nothing to do with professional admiration and everything to do with the specific person she was when she dropped the performance, the dryness of her humor, the way she thought before she spoke rather than while she was speaking, the particular quality of attention she gave things she found important. It was also true that she was his CEO, that he'd been at Meridian for less than 4 months, that he had a 7-year-old daughter and a complicated interior life, and no particular right to be developing any feelings about anyone right now. These were real facts. He held them alongside the other real facts and tried to find the appropriate equilibrium. He mostly managed it. What he couldn't fully manage was a Thursday afternoon in mid-March when he was working late. Emma was at an after-school program on Thursdays, didn't need to be picked up until 6, and most of the office had cleared out by 5:30, and he was finishing a project log update with the particular focus of an empty room when he heard her office door open and footsteps in the corridor. And then Charlotte appeared in the doorway of the workspace, looking like someone who had been inside her own head for several hours and had just surfaced. She stopped when she saw him. "You're still here." "You're still here," he said. "I had a call until 5. She looked at the mostly empty office. "Everyone left?" "Pauline left at 5:10. Marco stayed until 5:20, but I think he had somewhere to be." Charlotte walked into the workspace and sat in Pauline's vacant chair. Not her usual meeting room formality, just sat in the nearest available seat, like someone who was tired of standing up. "How's the Phase 3 documentation coming?" "Done," he said. "I was just cleaning up the log." She nodded. Then, not as a transition, but as a real question. "Do you ever feel like the work is fine, but the work around the work is 10 times more complicated?" Nathan saved his document. "Every day. The board wants a full strategic review in April. That's on top of the Ralston Amendment presentations and the Q1 reporting cycle." She was looking at the surface of Pauline's desk rather than at him. "I don't mind any of it individually. It's just everything at the same time." "Do you have people to help with the strategic review prep?" "Vane's handling the legal framing. My assistant is managing the calendar architecture. Hartley has the operations section." A pause. "It's not that I don't have people. It's that the final synthesis still lands on me." "Because it should," Nathan said. She looked at him. "You're the one who sees the whole thing," he said. "Anyone else can produce a section. You're the only one who understands how they connect." She was quiet for a moment. "That's either a compliment or a description of a structural problem." "Can be both," he said. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, just a small release of something. She sat back slightly in Pauline's chair. "How's Emma?" "She's good. She gave a presentation at school this week about octopus cognition. Her teacher sent me a note saying she used the word neurological." Charlotte made a sound that was clearly a laugh before she caught it. "She's 7. She's corrected me twice this month about things I said incorrectly, with sources." "She sounds like she's going to be terrifying when she's 40, Charlotte said, and the warmth in it was unguarded in a way that didn't feel like an accident. "She really will be," Nathan agreed. The office around them was quiet in the specific way of a building after business hours, the ambient hum of systems still running, the distant sound of the elevator, the city outside the windows doing its evening thing. It was not a dramatic silence. It was just the ordinary quiet of 2 people who were not quite ready to leave yet, for reasons that neither of them was fully articulating. Charlotte stood first. "I should let you finish." "I'm finished," he said. I didn't have anywhere to be for another 30 minutes. She stood by Pauline's desk and looked at him with an expression he didn't try to categorize. "I'm going to order food before I go through the April board materials," she said. "There's a place on the corner that does a very good Thai food, if you haven't eaten." She said it the way someone said something they'd decided quickly, without giving themselves time to reconsider. I'm not trying to make this strange. It's not strange, he said. I just meant. She stopped. It's been a long day, and you're the only person left in the office. I know what you meant, he said, which was the honest thing, and also the kind thing. A pause. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They ordered food from the place on the corner and ate it in the conference room with the documents spread between them, her board prep materials on one side, his cleaned-up project log on the other. And they talked about the April review for 20 minutes, and then talked about other things for another 40. And Nathan found out that she'd grown up in a small city in Ohio and had wanted to study architecture before she'd ended up in business. And she found out that he'd been a competitive swimmer in high school and hadn't been in a pool in 4 years. Neither of them made anything of any of it. He left at 7:40 and she was still there, working, when he walked past her office on the way to the elevator. She raised a hand in a brief goodbye without looking up from her screen. He took the elevator down and walked out into the March evening where the air finally, genuinely, smelled like spring might actually be coming, and he drove to pick up Emma and listen to her describe the entire plot of a book she'd read in one sitting, and he was present for all of it. But underneath the ordinary evening, something had shifted in a way he wasn't sure he could undo. It wasn't anything he'd decided. It was just something that was becoming true. The way things became true. Incrementally, then completely, before you'd quite notice the transition. He didn't do anything about it. There was nothing to do, yet. But he stopped pretending it wasn't there. The April board review came and went, with the controlled intensity of an event that had been over-prepared for and under-dramatized in the execution, which was exactly how Charlotte had wanted it. The strategic presentation ran 90 minutes. The questions from the board were pointed but answerable, and Corwin, who had arrived with the particular stillness of a man conserving energy for a fight, asked 2 sharp questions about the Q2 hiring plan and then sat back and said nothing else for the remainder of the meeting. Charlotte had read that silence correctly. Not agreement, but the specific quiet of someone who had decided to watch rather than act. It was the most comfortable version of Corwin she was likely to get, and she accepted it without celebration. What she couldn't as easily manage was the thing that had been accumulating since March. The dinner that hadn't been a dinner, the early mornings, the conversations that started as operational and ended somewhere less categorizable. She was a precise person by nature and by practice, and the fact that she could not be precise about Nathan Pierce was something she noticed with the specific discomfort of someone who preferred to understand exactly where they stood. She understood where she stood professionally. That was clear. He was a coordinator 2 levels below her, 6 months into his tenure, performing well above expectations. That was the professional story, and it was clean and complete and required nothing further from her. The other story was harder. She'd told herself, after the Thai food and the board prep and the 40 minutes of conversation that had no operational purpose, that it was simply the natural result of proximity and mutual respect. That she liked him as a person and found him easy to talk to, and that was a normal thing that happened between colleagues who got along. She'd told herself this with some conviction for approximately 3 weeks, and then stopped because she was, if nothing else, honest with herself about things when they became obvious. It was obvious. She didn't do anything about it. The reasons were real. The organizational hierarchy, the relative newness of his tenure, the specific vulnerability of a man who was raising a child alone and didn't need additional complication in his life. She was his employer. The power differential was not theoretical. She was also 30 years old and had spent 4 years running a company and had gotten very good at making difficult decisions and then living with them without constant revisitation. And the decision she made in April was to hold what she felt at a careful distance and do her job and let time do whatever time was going to do. It was a sound decision. It was also, she was dimly aware, one she would have to keep making repeatedly, which was the problem with sound decisions involving feelings. You didn't make them once. Nathan, for his part, was doing the same thing, though Charlotte didn't know that. She observed him professionally. He was composed, capable, and gave her nothing that could be read as anything other than appropriate regard for his direct chain of command. If there was something underneath that, he was careful enough not to let it show, which was either good discipline or a sign that she'd been misreading the situation entirely. She allowed for both possibilities. Then the situation with Richard Aldham made everything more complicated. Muck. Richard Aldham was the investor from the Alderton bar, the man named Richard whose dinner Charlotte had escaped on a November night 6 months ago. Nathan had never learned his last name. He didn't need to that night, and he'd thought about the man possibly twice since then. What he hadn't known, and what became relevant on a Wednesday morning in late April, was that Aldham was a significant indirect stakeholder in Meridian through a private equity firm called Vantage Capital that held a minority position in the company. He wasn't a board member. He didn't have voting rights. But he had the kind of access that came with a substantial check written at the right time, and in the world Charlotte operated in, that access meant his opinions had weight whether or not they were formally invited. Nathan found out about Aldham because Pauline told him, and Pauline told him because she'd overheard something she thought he should know. "Aldham's been making noise," Pauline said, on that Wednesday morning, without preamble. She was refilling her coffee and didn't look at him while she said it. "Not formally, in the way those people make noise." Nathan waited. He told someone at Vantage that he thought Charlotte was making personnel decisions based on personal relationships rather than professional criteria. She paused. He was specific enough that the person he said it to understood which personnel decisions he meant. The information landed clearly. Nathan understood exactly what it meant, and exactly where it had come from, and exactly how it was designed to land. "He's talking about the hire." "He's talking about the hire," Pauline confirmed. "He doesn't know what the connection is. He just knows Charlotte hired someone outside the standard profile, and he has a theory about why." "His theory is wrong," Nathan said. "I know that," Pauline said. "You know that. Charlotte knows that. The question is whether it matters that someone with Aldham's access is circulating a different version." Nathan was quiet. He looked at his screen without seeing it. "Does Charlotte know he's saying this?" "I don't know what Charlotte knows," Pauline said. "I know what I heard." She poured her coffee and went back to her desk, which was her way of indicating the conversation was complete. He sat with it for the rest of the morning. He thought about the bar, the way Aldham had watched Charlotte walk away from the table, the flatness in the man's expression that Nathan had clocked and filed and mostly forgotten. He thought about how much of this could be traced back to a 30-second decision in a crowded room. The choice to stand up and cross the floor because someone looked like they needed a way out. The problem with Aldham's version of events wasn't just that it was wrong. It was that it contained enough surface plausibility to be damaging. Charlotte had hired someone from a non-standard background after a single encounter. Anyone who didn't know the full timeline could construct a narrative from those facts. Aldham was constructing it deliberately. Nathan went to Charlotte's office at 1 o'clock. He knocked on the open door. Her assistant looked up from a desk in the outer office and said Charlotte was available, and he went in. She was reading something on her screen and looked up when he entered with the expression of someone switching contexts. "Nathan, I need to tell you something," he said, "and I want to do it directly rather than through Gerald." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. He sat. He told her what Pauline had told him as plainly as he could. He didn't editorialize. He laid out what he knew and where it came from and let her form her own picture. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was still for a moment. Something moved through her expression. Something that wasn't surprise, which told him she'd had some version of this information already, or had been expecting it. "Aldham," she said, in a tone that had several layers he didn't try to peel apart. "I figured you might already know." "I had an indication. Not this specifically." She was looking at a point past his shoulder, thinking. "How did Pauline—" "She knows things," Nathan said. "I've stopped asking." Charlotte looked at him. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Okay? Is there anything in how I've managed your position here, any decision, any conversation, any accommodation, that someone looking at it from the outside without knowing the full context could reasonably read as preferential?" Nathan thought about it for real, which was what she needed him to do. The Callaway situation. He'd found the problem and reported it, and Foss had taken it up the chain. The Fenwick Review. Corwin's scrutiny had been met with clean documentation. The Ralston contract. He'd caught it himself and brought it to Foss within the hour. The Thai food and the board prep, two colleagues working late, which happened in every organization in the world. No, he said, nothing that isn't defensible on its own terms. Are you sure? The only thing I can think of, he said carefully, is that you've been more transparent with me about the organizational politics than you might normally be with someone 6 months in. The conversation about Corwin, the board review. A pause. That could be read as closer than standard. Charlotte absorbed this. I told you those things because you were the subject of them, and I thought you deserved to know. I know that, he said. I'm not questioning it. I'm answering the question you asked. She was quiet for a moment. She picked up her pen and set it down. Aldham's position with Vantage gives him a platform but not authority. He can make noise. He can't make decisions. I know. This isn't something that can hurt you professionally if your work record is what it is, and it is. She said it directly, without softening. What it can do is create friction at the board level at a time when I'd prefer not to have additional friction. Nathan thought about Corwin, who had been settling into something approaching neutral, about the April review that had just stabilized the room, about the specific timing of Aldham's interference, which felt deliberate whether or not it was. What do you want me to do? He said. Keep doing exactly what you're doing, she said. Nothing changes. We don't react to this because reacting to it implies there's something to react to. She looked at him steadily. The work is the answer. It's the only answer that matters. Okay, he said. I also want to say... She stopped, started over. The reason I hired you had nothing to do with what happened at the Alderton. I made that clear to you the morning after your interview, and I'm making it clear again now because I think you should hear it with this information on the table. I know, Nathan said. I've never thought otherwise. I want to be sure. Charlotte. He said her name simply, without performing it. I know. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in the set of her shoulders changed slightly, a small release. All right, she said. Close the door on your way out. He did. May arrived in the way of a month that had something to prove. Unexpectedly warm, with the city opening its windows and everyone behaving slightly better than they had in February, the way people always did when the light came back. Emma had a school play in the second week of May, which she had been preparing for with a level of seriousness that Nathan found both admirable and slightly unnerving. She was playing a scientist, which had been her first choice, and which she had selected over the lead role, a princess, with the casual certainty of someone who didn't need the explanation to be understood. The scientist discovers the thing, she'd explained to Nathan. The princess just gets found. He'd agreed that this was a fair analysis. He took the afternoon off for the play, which Foss approved without comment, and he sat in a folding chair in an elementary school gymnasium among 30 other parents and relatives and watched Emma explain the water cycle to an audience of 7-year-olds and assorted adults with the authority of someone who had actually read the material. She was excellent. She was also visibly nervous in the first 2 minutes and visibly not nervous after that, which was a transition Nathan recognized because he'd watched it happen in himself enough times to know what it looked like from the outside. The moment when the thing you're afraid of becomes just the thing you're doing. He stayed for the reception afterward, juice and cookies in the gymnasium foyer, the organized chaos of children released from performance pressure, and talked to a few other parents, answered Emma's teacher's genuinely warm assessment of Emma's preparation, and watched his daughter move through the space with the confidence of someone who knew she'd done well and didn't need to be told. On the drive home, Emma was quiet in the particular post-performance way of someone who has been intensely present for several hours and is now processing the return to ordinary life. You were really good, Nathan said. I know, she said. I messed up the part about condensation, though. Nobody noticed. I noticed. You're 7, Emma. You're allowed to get condensation slightly wrong. She thought about this. I guess. A beat. Becca came up to me after and said I was good. Becca from the playground thing? Yeah. Emma looked out the window. She said she didn't mean what she said before. About the mom thing. Nathan let a moment pass. What did you say? I said okay. Emma turned back to the window. It's not like she's my best friend now, but it's fine. People say stuff. He thought about the specific wisdom of a 7-year-old who had already learned how to accept an imperfect apology and not make it more than it was. That's a pretty mature way to handle it. I know, Emma said, without any particular pride about it. Can we get pizza? They got pizza. The thing with Aldum resolved itself, in the way that things sometimes resolved when you didn't engage with them, through the weight of evidence outrunning the narrative. The Q1 results for the projects Nathan had coordinated or contributed to were objectively strong. Callaway had signed a contract extension. Fenwick had given Meridian a reference letter for a new client pitch. Ralston had moved into Phase 2 without incident. The work spoke in a language that even indirect stakeholders found difficult to argue with. Corwin said nothing. Vantage Capital said nothing, at least nothing that reached Charlotte officially. Aldum apparently moved on to other concerns. What remained, after the interference cleared, was the thing that had been there before it. The growing certainty on both sides of the organizational chart that the distance between professional and personal was more like a membrane than a wall. It was Nathan who tested it first, not deliberately, but because the situation created an opening he walked through before he'd fully decided to. It was a Friday in late May. The office was running at the reduced energy of a Friday afternoon. Foss had left early, Pauline was in a meeting, Marco had been working remotely all week. Nathan was finishing a project handoff document when Charlotte walked through the main workspace in her coat, bag over her shoulder, clearly leaving for the weekend. She slowed when she passed his desk. "Still here?" she said. 20 minutes, he said. "I want to finish this before Monday." She stopped. She looked like someone who had been in the building since 7:30 and had earned the end of the week. "It's Friday." "I know what day it is." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in her expression that was neither the CEO nor the carefully managed professional distance she'd been maintaining since March. It was just her, in a coat, tired at the end of a long week, looking at him like a person looked at another person they'd been not quite saying something to for several months. "I'm going to a thing," she said, "on Saturday. A fundraiser. It's for a pediatric literacy foundation, one of the company's community partners. It's not—" She stopped. "It's not purely a work event. It'll probably be boring in parts, but it's a decent organization." Nathan waited. "Emma might like it, actually," Charlotte said, and he could hear her choosing the words with some care. "There's a children's component, a reading event for the kids while the adults do the fundraiser portion. I have an extra ticket because my assistant had a family thing come up." He understood exactly what she was doing, and he understood she'd given herself an out. The extra ticket, the children's component, the legitimate organizational connection. She'd built the offer a structure that meant if he declined, it didn't mean anything. It was, he thought, a very Charlotte way of doing something she wasn't fully sure about. "What time?" he said. Something in her expression changed. Not dramatically, just shifted. 10 o'clock. It's at the Harwell Center. The children's reading event runs from 10 to noon and there's a lunch after. "I'll ask Emma," he said. "If she's interested, we'll come." "It's not," Charlotte said again. "I know what it is," he said, the same way he'd said it before. She looked at him for a beat, and this time she didn't reach for the professional register to close the conversation. She just stood there, coat and bag, end of a Friday, looking at him with something that had stopped trying to be anything other than what it was. "Okay," she said. "Let me know tonight if she wants to come." "I will." She left. Nathan sat at his desk for another few minutes without moving. The office was nearly empty and very quiet. Outside the windows, the late May light was doing something generous with the buildings across the street, making everything look a little warmer than it had in months. He texted Emma, even though she was at Mrs. Delgado's and probably not watching her phone. "Saturday event at the Harwell Center tomorrow. Reading thing for kids, then lunch. You interested?" The reply came back in 4 minutes. "With who?" He thought about how to answer that. He typed, "Someone from work." "My boss, actually." 3 dots. A pause longer than usual, then, "Is she nice?" He looked at the question for a moment, then, "Yeah, she's pretty great." Emma's response was immediate and definitive. Okay, but I pick what I read. He read it twice, and then he closed his phone and went back to the handoff document. And he finished it in 15 minutes and saved it and closed his laptop and left the office. And the evening was warm in the way of a late May Friday, full of people who had somewhere to go and were glad about it. For the first time in a long time, he felt like one of them. The Harwell Center sat at the edge of the Arts District, a renovated building that had been a printing warehouse in a previous life and still had the bones of it. High ceilings, exposed brick, wide windows that let the late May light come in at angles that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Charlotte arrived at 9:45, which was 10 minutes earlier than she'd told Nathan, because she needed the 10 minutes to stand near the registration table and remind herself that she was a professional adult who had organized her feelings about the situation in a reasonable and sustainable way. She had not, it turned out, organized them as thoroughly as she'd thought. She was talking to the event coordinator, an energetic woman named Diane, who ran the Literacy Foundation and who talked at the speed of someone perpetually underfunded and overcommitted, when she saw them come through the door. Nathan was in a jacket she hadn't seen before, dark gray, the kind of casual formal that suggested he'd thought about it without overthinking it. He had his hand on Emma's shoulder, not steering her, just present. And Emma was wearing a dress that had clearly been her own selection, dark blue with small white stars paired with red sneakers that matched nothing and suited her completely. She was carrying a book. Of course she was carrying a book. She had it under her arm with the particular grip of someone who considered it a necessary item for any outing, the way other people carried phones. Charlotte had seen photographs of Emma in her mind, assembled from descriptions, the specificity of Nathan's stories, the details that surfaced when he talked about his daughter without quite meaning to. The real Emma was both exactly what she'd expected and somehow more immediate. She had Nathan's directness and something else that was entirely her own, a quality of attention, a way of observing a room that was neither shy nor performing. She was looking around the Harwell Center with the particular interest of someone gathering information. Charlotte walked toward them. Nathan saw her first. His expression did the thing it did sometimes, a brief settling, like something coming into focus. And then he smiled, which was not a thing he did all that often, and which Charlotte had decided some time ago she was not going to make a habit of cataloging. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said, and then looked at Emma, who had transferred her observational attention from the room to Charlotte with a directness that was slightly startling. "You must be Emma." Emma considered her. "You're Charlotte," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Dad said you're pretty great," Emma said, with the uncalculating honesty of someone who had not yet learned to dress information up before delivering it. Something happened in Nathan's expression that he immediately controlled. Charlotte did not look at him. "He's very kind," she said, keeping her voice even. "He doesn't say that about most people," Emma said, which was apparently just additional data she felt was relevant. "Emma," Nathan said. "What? It's true." Emma looked at the room again. "Where are the books?" Odd. The children's reading event was in a side room off the main hall. Low tables, cushioned floor space, a young woman named Tess with the gift of reading aloud in a way that made an entire room of 7- and 8-year-olds go still. Emma selected a spot approximately 4 feet from Tess and sat down with the self-possession of someone who had found the optimal position and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Nathan and Charlotte stood at the entrance to the main hall where the adult portion of the fundraiser was beginning to fill. Coffee, light food, the quiet networking of people who cared about the same cause and hadn't seen each other in 3 months. "She's exactly what I expected," Charlotte said, still watching Emma through the doorway. "That's either a compliment or a warning," Nathan said. "Both, I think." She looked at him. "She called you kind." "She was quoting me back at you," he said, "in the most direct way possible." "You did say it," Charlotte said. "I said you were pretty great." Those were the words. A pause. "She's 7. She streamlines." Charlotte looked at him for a moment and then looked back into the room where Emma had leaned forward slightly toward whatever Tess was reading, already absorbed, already somewhere else. "She's going to be okay," Charlotte said. "You know that, right? Whatever you're worried about with her, she's going to be okay." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. I know. Another pause. I still worry. I know you do. She said it simply without trying to fix it. They stood there for a moment side by side, and there was nothing extraordinary about it. Two people watching a child read, in a room full of people doing ordinary things, and yet it was the most unguarded Nathan had seen her outside of a late Thursday evening in an empty office, and it was the most clearly he'd understood, in one sustained moment, that whatever was building between them was not a thing either of them had engineered or pursued. It had simply grown in the space between everything they'd done for the right reasons, without asking permission. The fundraiser ran until 12:30, and they stayed for all of it. Charlotte worked the room the way she worked every room, present, attentive, genuine without being warm to the point of imprecision. And Nathan watched her talk to Diane about the foundation's expansion goals, watched her listen to a board member's concerns about grant funding with the real attention she gave, things she found important, watched her be exactly the same person in a room full of people she didn't know as she was in a conference room or a kitchen or an empty office at the end of a Thursday. That consistency was something he'd noticed about her from the beginning. Most people had different registers, the work version, the social version, the version they showed when they were tired and had nothing left to perform. Charlotte had registers too, but the foundation underneath them was the same. She didn't become a different person depending on the audience. Emma emerged from the reading room at noon with her book and the focused expression of someone who had processed a great deal and was ready to share it. She attached herself to the periphery of Nathan and Charlotte's immediate orbit without making it look intentional, which Nathan suspected was not actually accidental. "What were you reading?" Charlotte asked her. "First they read to us," Emma said, "which was okay, but then there was free reading time, so I read my own book." She held it up, a children's science book on deep ocean creatures, obviously. "I'm at the part about the dragonfish. They have light organs called photophores." "Photophores," Charlotte said. "They're like built-in flashlights," Emma said, "except biological." "I actually didn't know that." Emma looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. "Most people don't," she said generously. "It's pretty specialized." Nathan looked at the ceiling briefly. They walked to a small restaurant 2 blocks from the Harwell Center. Charlotte had mentioned it. Nathan had said fine. Emma had said she wanted pasta, which was non-negotiable. And they sat at a table by the window in the Saturday afternoon light and ordered food and talked, and the conversation moved the way conversations moved when 3 people had different amounts of information about each other and were filling in the gaps in real time. Emma asked Charlotte what her job was. Charlotte explained it. Emma asked several follow-up questions about what a CEO actually did on a daily basis, which Charlotte answered with the directness she gave most things. And Emma listened and then said, "So you're basically in charge of making sure everyone else can do their jobs." "That's a good way to put it," Charlotte said. "That's what my dad does," Emma said, "except smaller." "Emma," Nathan said, "I mean at home. He makes sure I can do my stuff." She was looking at her pasta, unconcerned. "He's always the one making things work. He doesn't really talk about it." A silence fell that wasn't awkward so much as full. Charlotte looked at Nathan across the table with an expression he couldn't entirely decode, something layered and careful and more open than usual. "He's good at that," Charlotte said. Emma looked up. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm saying." Nathan reached over and moved Emma's napkin from the table to her lap, which was a thing he did automatically because she always forgot. And Emma accepted this without breaking conversational stride, and Charlotte watched it happen with the particular quality of attention she reserved for things she wanted to understand rather than just observe. It was a small thing, the smallest possible thing, and it was the most honest moment Charlotte had seen between 2 people in a long time. The specific intimacy of someone who knew exactly where another person's napkin was going to end up and moved it without making it a statement. She understood, sitting at that table, something she'd been circling for months without landing on directly. Nathan Pierce was not a remarkable person in the ways that typically announce themselves. He wasn't charming in the disarming way, wasn't impressive in the room-quieting way, wasn't the kind of man who made you feel like something was happening when you talked to him. What he was entirely consistent. He was the same person in the bar, on a November night as he was in an interview the next morning, the same person who caught a contract error at 7:52 a.m. as the one who moved his daughter's napkin without thinking. The kindness wasn't a performance. It was just how he was built. That, she thought, was actually the rarest thing. They walked back to the Harwell Center afterward to pick up Charlotte's car, which she'd parked in the structure behind it, and Emma walked between them on the sidewalk talking about the dragonfish and the photophores and a theory she had about why deep-sea creatures evolved their own light sources, which involved something about competition and resource scarcity that was, Nathan had to admit, reasonably sophisticated for a second grader. At the parking structure entrance, they stopped. "Thank you for coming," Charlotte said to Emma first, which Emma received with a nod that suggested she'd found the event acceptable. Then she looked at Nathan. "Thank you. We should do it again sometime, Jason," he said. It was a low-stakes thing to say, the kind of thing people said. But between them, with everything that had accumulated between a November bar and a May Saturday sidewalk, it wasn't quite the low-stakes thing it would have been between strangers. Charlotte looked at him. "Yeah," she said, "we should." Emma, who had been examining something on the sidewalk near the curb, looked up. "We could go to the aquarium," she said. "They have a deep-sea section." A brief pause. "That's a specific suggestion," Nathan said. "I have a lot of specific suggestions," Emma said, and went back to whatever she'd been looking at. Nathan looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at Nathan. Something passed between them that had no language for it, not yet, but which both of them recognized as the thing that had been there for months without a name, and which now, in the ordinary May sunlight on an ordinary city sidewalk, had stopped requiring one quite so urgently. "I'll text you," Charlotte said. "Okay," he said. She walked into the parking structure. Emma watched her go, then looked at Nathan with the expression she used when she was about to say something she'd been thinking for a while. "I like her," Emma said. "Yeah?" Nathan said. "She listens when I talk," Emma said. "Like, actually listens. Not the polite kind." Nathan watched the parking structure entrance for a moment after Charlotte had disappeared into it. "Yeah," he said. "She does." Emma slipped her hand into his, which she didn't usually do anymore. She was 7 and had opinions about being treated like a baby. And they walked back toward his car, and Nathan felt something that he didn't have an immediate word for, something that sat in his chest without pressing, something that felt less like the end of a held breath and more like the first real breath in a long time. June arrived the way it did in this city, suddenly, completely, with the kind of heat that reminded you winter had been real, by contrast. The Meridian office ran its air conditioning 3 weeks early, and everyone complained about it being too cold inside while the city cooked outside the windows, which was a complaint without a solution, and which everyone made anyway. Nathan had been at Meridian for 8 months. The Callaway account had renewed. The Fenwick project had gone live with full client approval. Ralston was in its final phase with no new incidents. The Corwin situation had resolved into something close to grudging respect. Nathan had overheard Corwin tell Charlotte, in the hallway outside her office, that the Ralston catch alone had saved the company a significant potential liability, a statement delivered in the tone of a man acknowledging something without enjoying the acknowledgement. Charlotte had said thank you in the tone of a woman who did not need validation and did not plan to ask for it. Foss gave Nathan the mid-year performance review in the second week of June. He sat across the desk with the review form face down between them and said, "You know what's on this?" "More or less," Nathan said. Foss flipped it over. The ratings were strong across every category: initiative, judgment, communication, leadership potential. There was a handwritten note at the bottom in Foss's precise, small script. "Recommend for senior coordinator track. Above expectations across all dimensions. Retain." Nathan looked at it. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Foss said. "I just wrote down what happened." He took the form back and signed it. "Charlotte's been asking about the senior coordinator role, if you want it." "I want it," Nathan said. "Good." Foss capped his pen. "You should know that Hartley had some concerns about the timeline. Thought it was too fast for someone at 8 months. What did Charlotte say? She said the timeline is based on performance, not calendar. Foss looked at him with the particular expression he used when delivering information that was also, secondarily, a message. She said it twice, in the same meeting. Nathan held that for a moment. Okay? Okay, Foss agreed and stood, and that was the end of the review. The senior coordinator announcement went out on a Thursday. Internal memo, copied to the full operations team. Nathan read it on his screen at his desk with Pauline 2 workstations away, and Pauline said nothing, which meant she was very aware of exactly what was happening. Marco came over at 11 and said, "Congrats," with the specific expression of someone who had wanted the thing and hadn't gotten it and was managing that with approximately 70% success. Nathan thanked him without making it more than it was. Marco went back to his desk. It would be fine eventually. These things were usually fine eventually. At 2 o'clock, Charlotte's assistant appeared at the edge of the workspace and told Nathan that Charlotte wanted to see him when he had a moment. He had a moment. Her office was different in the afternoon light. The shadows went different directions. The city outside the window had a different texture. She was standing when he came in by the window rather than at her desk, which was unusual. She turned when he knocked on the open door. "Close it," she said. He closed it. She didn't sit. He didn't sit. They stood in the middle of her office like two people who had run out of the infrastructure they'd been using to manage a conversation because the infrastructure had finally become inadequate to what was actually happening. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need to say it in this building, in this office, clearly, before anything else happens. Because the context matters, and I don't want there to be any ambiguity about it." He waited. "I promoted you because you earned it," she said. "Every piece of work you've done here has been documented and reviewed by Gerald, and by me, and by Vane, and by 2 board members. The decision is clean. I need you to know that before I say anything else." "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway. Because what I'm about to say next has nothing to do with Meridian Logistics, and I want that line to be absolutely clear." He held still. "I've been managing something," she said, with the careful honesty of someone who had decided to stop managing it, "since approximately March, maybe longer. And I'm telling you now because we're not going to the aquarium as colleagues, and I think you know that, and I think you've known it for a while, and I'm tired of acting like precision requires me to say nothing." The office was very quiet. The air conditioning hummed somewhere above them. "I'm also aware," she said, "of everything that makes this complicated. The organization, the hierarchy, the fact that you've been here 8 months and I'm your employer, and that is a real thing with real implications." She paused. "I'm not asking you to do anything about any of this tonight or this week or on any particular schedule. I'm just being honest with you. Because you've been honest with me from the beginning, and you deserve the same thing back." Nathan looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd learned to look at things he wanted to understand completely before he responded to them. "Can I say something?" he said. "Yes." "The night at the bar," he said. "I didn't cross that room because I was trying to do something good. I crossed it because someone looked like they needed a way out, and I was the only person paying attention. That's the whole story." He paused. "I'm telling you that because I think it's relevant to what you just said. The things I've done here, the Callaway file, the Ralston contract, all of it, I didn't do those things to impress you or to build a case for myself. I did them because they were the right thing to do. And the reason I'm telling you that is because I want you to understand that whatever I feel about you has nothing to do with any of that. It's not because you gave me an opportunity. It's not because I'm grateful. It's because of who you are when you're tired at the end of a Thursday, and you still answer the actual question instead of an easier version of it." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "And the aquarium," he said. "I want to go to the aquarium." Something in her expression changed, not softened. That was still the wrong word for her. More like arrived, like something had been traveling for a long time and had found where it was going. "Emma's going to talk about photophores the entire time," she said. "Almost certainly," he said. A pause that had nothing uncomfortable in it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They went to the aquarium on a Saturday in late June, the 3 of them, and it was exactly what Emma had promised, and nothing that anyone had entirely prepared for. Emma was a remarkably demanding aquarium companion. She had done prior research, which meant she already knew what they were going to see and had opinions about the accuracy of the exhibit labels, and pointed out twice that the descriptions of certain fish behaviors were simplified to the point of inaccuracy, which the nearby staff member handled with admirable patience. She insisted on the deep sea section first, which required backtracking from the main entrance, which Nathan and Charlotte did without complaint. In front of the dragonfish exhibit, a darkened tank with the specific blue-black lighting that made everything look like it existed at the bottom of the world, Emma pressed her face to the glass and said, "There," in a tone of profound satisfaction, and stood there for 4 minutes while the people behind her waited with varying degrees of patience. Nathan stood beside her. Charlotte stood beside Nathan. At some point during those 4 minutes, without either of them making a decision about it, her hand found his, and he held it. And Emma, who was explaining something about photophore density to the fish, did not comment. Later, at the cafe on the aquarium's upper level, Emma had a hot chocolate and Nathan had coffee and Charlotte had tea, and they sat at a table by the window that looked out over the harbor, and Emma had finally run out of specific deep-sea facts and was drawing something in the back pages of her book, which was what she did when she'd had enough social energy and needed a few minutes of internal space without actually removing herself from the situation. Charlotte watched her draw. "What's she working on?" "Hard to say," Nathan said. "Could be a diagram. Could be a story. Last week it was a map of a fictional island." "Does the island have a name?" "7 names. She can't decide." Charlotte smiled at her tea. "What were they?" "I can't remember all of them. One was Phosphora." He paused. "One was Margaret, which I thought was a bold choice for an island." Charlotte laughed. The real one. The brief, unguarded one that she still didn't do frequently enough for Nathan to stop noticing when it happened. Emma looked up from her drawing at the sound of it, registered Charlotte's expression, and went back to her work with a small private smile that she didn't direct at anyone. Nathan saw it. He didn't say anything about it. Some things were better left where they were. There's a version of this story that would end with a grand gesture, a declaration, a dramatic moment, a clear before and after that you could point to and say, "There, that's where everything changed." That's the version stories often told themselves because it was clean and satisfying and didn't ask anything complicated from the people listening. The real version was harder to locate. The real version was a man sitting in a bar he'd never entered before, paying attention to something most people had stopped looking at, and making a decision that cost him nothing and changed everything. It was the same man, 3 years into the hardest chapter of his life, showing up consistently, for his daughter, for his work, for the small choices that nobody kept score of because there was no scoreboard for them. It was a woman at 30 years old who had built something real and difficult and was still, underneath the precision and the capability, someone who could be rattled by a conversation she hadn't wanted to have in a bar, and who had spent months being honest with herself about what she felt, even when the honest thing was inconvenient, and who had finally said the inconvenient thing out loud in an afternoon office because she'd decided that clarity was better than comfort. Neither of them was perfect. Nathan could be so self-contained that the people close to him had to work to find the opening. He carried his grief quietly, sometimes too quietly, in the way of someone who had learned early that falling apart was a luxury single parents couldn't schedule. He second-guessed himself in ways he didn't show anyone, and he had nights where the weight of raising Emma alone settled on him like something physical, and he sat in the kitchen after she was asleep and felt the absence of Laura not as sharp pain, but as a persistent low-grade ache that never fully resolved. Charlotte had her own edges. She could be remote in ways that read as coldness when they were actually caution. She'd spent 4 years building professional authority and had gotten so good at it that the line between the CEO and the person sometimes blurred in directions that were hard to reverse. She didn't trust easily, which was functional in her position and harder in the rest of her life. She had canceled 3 personal relationships in the past 4 years because they'd interfered with her capacity to function at work, and she wasn't fully proud of that. But she also wasn't sure she'd made the wrong call, which was maybe the most honest thing about her. 2 imperfect people, making imperfect decisions in the direction of something real. That's actually the only version worth telling. Emma's school had a community event in September, first week of school, welcome back morning, the kind of low-key gathering that elementary schools organized as a gentle on-ramp back to routine. Parents in the courtyard, kids released from the opening assembly and sent outside to find their families before the school day properly began. Charlotte was there because Nathan had mentioned it, and she'd said she'd like to come if it wasn't strange, and he'd said it wasn't strange. She stood near the courtyard gate in the early September morning, the air finally cooling toward something tolerable, the summer releasing its grip 1 degree at a time, and she watched the doors of the school building open and the children pour out in the particular organized chaos of 100 kids looking for specific faces. She saw Emma before Emma saw Nathan. The little girl came through the doors in the second wave, her book bag slightly too large for her frame, her star-patterned dress replaced today by something with a dinosaur on it. She was scanning the courtyard with that particular attention of hers, the one that had been the first thing Charlotte had noticed about her. Not anxious, just precise, looking for the right thing. She found him. Nathan was standing to Charlotte's left, about 15 feet away, and he raised his hand slightly when he spotted Emma, and Emma's face did something that Charlotte was not prepared for. It opened. Completely, entirely, without reservation. The precision dropped away, and what was underneath it was nothing but pure, uncomplicated joy. The specific joy of a child who has found the person she needed to find, who was never truly worried but is relieved anyway. The deep tissue relief of a kid running toward the one person in the world who is always exactly where they said they'd be. She ran across the courtyard with her book bag bouncing and her sneakers loud on the pavement, and Nathan crouched down as she got close, and she hit him at full speed, arms around his neck, laughing at something, maybe the impact, maybe just the morning, maybe the simple fact of it. And he caught her completely and stood up with her, and she was still laughing, her feet off the ground, his arms around her like something that had never been uncertain. Charlotte stood at the gate and watched it. She had thought, in the bar on a November night, that she was watching a man help a stranger. She had thought, in the interview room the next morning, that she was assessing a candidate. She had thought, through months of careful professional management, that she understood what she was dealing with. She hadn't understood. What she was watching now was the whole explanation, not of one decision or one night or one interview, but of everything, assembled into a single 30-second moment in a school courtyard. The man who had crossed a room for no reason, except that it was the right thing to do, was the same man who showed up every day at the same time, so his daughter never had to wonder. The integrity he'd brought to a contract discrepancy at 7:52 in the morning was the same quality that had made him stand up in a crowded bar without a plan. He didn't have different standards for different contexts. He just had standards, and he kept them regardless of whether anyone was watching. Most people talked about character as if it were a thing you demonstrated in large moments. Charlotte had spent enough time in rooms where large moments happened to know that large moments were mostly theater. Character was the small stuff. The napkin moved without comment. The cup of coffee poured before his own, the 8:17 morning when he triple-checked his understanding before bringing a problem to his supervisor. The 10,000 things that nobody cataloged because there was no system for recording them, that added up invisibly to the person someone actually was. Emma saw her mother in Charlotte's direction and waved, still in Nathan's arms, satisfied, going nowhere. Charlotte waved back. Nathan turned and found her with his eyes across the courtyard. He was smiling in the way she'd cataloged without meaning to, open and unhurried. The smile of a man who was, in this particular moment, not managing anything at all. She walked toward them. This is what she believed, by the end of it, not as a lesson learned or a moral arrived at, but as something she understood from the inside, the way you understood things that had happened to you rather than things you'd been told. She believed that the people who helped others when there was nothing in it for them were not saints or heroes. They were just people who had stayed connected to something that was easy to lose track of, the simple awareness that other people were real and present and sometimes needed you to pay attention. That sounds obvious. It isn't, as it turns out. Most people stopped paying attention somewhere around the time the world started asking them to pay attention to too many things at once. Nathan Pierce had not stopped. Whether that was temperament or grief or the specific effect of raising a child alone, of being the person that a small human was always watching, she couldn't fully say. Maybe it didn't matter why. What mattered was the fact of it. She also believed, And this one was harder to say without it sounding like a platitude, but she believed it anyway. That the work you did when no one was watching was the only reliable indicator of who you actually were. Awards and performance reviews and board approvals told you what someone could do under observation. What they did at 7:52 in the morning, before anyone was looking, told you who they were. She had been looking for that without knowing she was looking for it, for longer than she'd been CEO of Meridian Logistics. She'd found it in a man who had helped a stranger escape a dinner she hadn't wanted to be at, on a rainy Thursday night, for no reason except that he was paying attention, and it seemed like the right thing to do. The rest of it, the interview, the job, the months of careful professional navigation, the aquarium and the late Thursdays in the school courtyard, was just the world doing what it occasionally did when two people were honest enough and patient enough and sufficiently unafraid of the complicated version. It showed them what they'd found. Nathan Pierce, at 32, had wanted two things when he'd walked into the Alderton bar on a November evening with rain in his jacket and an interview in the morning, stability for his daughter, and a future that didn't feel like something he was merely enduring. He'd gotten both, in ways he hadn't planned for and wouldn't have predicted. Emma, for her part, was thriving in the particular unstoppable way of a child who had always been fundamentally fine and had simply needed the external conditions to catch up with her interior certainty. She was reading 3 grade levels above her peers, had opinions about everything, and had recently started a handwritten guide to deep-sea creatures that she'd informed Nathan would eventually be published, the timeline of which was still under consideration. She had also, without announcement or ceremony, started calling Charlotte by her name rather than your boss, which was the clearest signal available from a 7-year-old that a person had been admitted into the circle of people who counted. Charlotte had not made a thing of it. Nathan had noticed and said nothing. Some things didn't need to be named to be true. Charlotte Bennett, at 30, was still running Meridian with the same precision and the same terrifying competence, and Corwin had stopped being a friction point sometime around Q2 and had, at the last board meeting, said something in passing about the company's improved contract review processes that was approximately as close to a compliment as he was capable of generating. Charlotte had thanked him without satisfaction, which was the correct response. She was also, for the first time in 4 years, not the last person in the building on Friday evenings. Sometimes Nathan was still there. Sometimes she left before him. Either way, someone noticed when the other one was gone, which was a small thing that turned out not to be small at all. They hadn't resolved everything. These things didn't resolve. They continued, adjusting, requiring maintenance, occasionally breaking down and requiring repair. Nathan still had nights with the low-grade weight of Laura's absence. Charlotte still defaulted to professional distance when she was stressed, rather than toward the people who could have helped her carry it. Emma still occasionally said things so direct that they produced a full second of stunned silence in the adults around her, which she found neither concerning nor interesting. They were imperfect people. That wasn't a flaw in the story. That was the story. One Thursday evening in October, the first real autumn cold, the city's trees doing their annual reluctant concession to the season, Charlotte was in her office finishing the last of the Q3 board materials when her phone buzzed. Nathan. A photograph. Emma, at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and colored pencils, working on what appeared to be the latest installment of the Deep-Sea Creature Guide. She was completely absorbed. Her hair was in her eyes, and she hadn't noticed. On the table beside her, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a mug of hot chocolate and a small plate with 2 cookies on it, already half-eaten. Below the photograph, Nathan had written, "She wanted me to tell you the Dragonfish chapter is almost done, and you'll be the first to read it." Charlotte looked at the photograph for a long moment. The office around her was quiet. Outside the windows, October was doing something with the light that made the city look gentler than it was. She wrote back, "Tell her I've been waiting." She put her phone down and went back to the board materials, and she was smiling in the way she smiled when no one was watching. Not the professional version, not the managed version, but the one that was just hers. Small and real and not performing anything at all. In a kitchen across the city, a 7-year-old pressed her pencil harder on the page, adding detail to a dragonfish that had been living in her imagination for 3 months and was finally, tonight, making its way into the world. Her father made dinner. The apartment was warm. Outside, the October city moved through its evening the way it always did, without particular ceremony, indifferent to the small and ordinary miracle taking place inside. A man who kept showing up, a woman who finally let herself be found, a child who had always known they'd both be fine. That's all it was. That was everything.